And good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a few short remarks before we'll let Joan kick it off for us. This webinar is hosted by the German Marshall Fund's Urban and Regional Policy Program. This program facilitates a sustainable network of globally aware and locally engaged leaders by promoting the transatlantic exchange of knowledge and the incubation of innovative solutions for current urban and regional challenges. And my name is Bartek Stardai. I'm a program assistant here at the Urban and Regional Policy Program, and I lead the Urban Fellowship Program, which is one of the ways that we try and achieve this mission. Our Urban and Regional Policy Fellowship Program is the core initiative of the program. It gives mid-career practitioners at the urban and regional levels the opportunity to meet with their counterparts across the Atlantic and examine policies that have been successfully implemented to address similar needs. And we're very excited today to bring you a presentation by Joan Byron, who was a 2012-2013 fellow with the program. She's an excellent example of how transatlantic learning could inform an issue of extreme relevance for both the United States and Europe, that of how public investment could mitigate inequality in our cities. To answer this question, Joan traveled to Amsterdam, Paris, and London over a period of several weeks. She interviewed dozens of activists, policymakers, and citizens across the three cities, and traveled on her bike, actually, which she brought over from New York City. Before I let Joan begin her presentation, I'll also mention that at the conclusion of their research, each of our fellows is responsible for producing a product summarizing his or her research. In this case, Joan produced an excellent policy brief summarizing the key features of her research and applications to the United States, and especially to her home city of New York. You can find this policy brief by navigating to our website, gmfus.org. And it's an excellent place to begin if you have any questions about any of the any parts of the presentation that Joan will give today. I'll also say that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available later on our website. And with that, Joan, I will let you kick it off.
Okay. Bartek, thank you for your kind words. And let me say that the impetus for my fellowship proposal and for the itinerary that I put together with the assistance of the German Marshall Fund was my experience as an activist planner in New York City. I'm director of policy at an organization called the Pratt Center for Community Development. We've existed for 50 years, and our mission is to bring to bear the resources of urbanistic professionals, planners, policy specialists, architects, and designers to work with organizations based in low and moderate income communities on the challenges of social, economic, and environmental justice that they face specifically in the built environment of New York City. And that over the years of our work and of my career, we've seen those challenges shift from the issues that are raised by abandonment and disinvestment and the flight of capital from U.S. cities to, at least in the case of New York and a handful of other U.S. cities that have emerged as global success stories, to the challenges of inequality and disparity, isolation and exclusion. And visually, that manifests strongly, and ever more strongly, in the contrast between the physical quality of the environment in poor neighborhoods and wealthy neighborhoods. And it was clear that this was not, this was not happening by coincidence, but that it was the result of a set of policies whose intentional outcome was the refashioning of New York's built environment to compete in a global and, in the minds of many people, post-industrial economy. And New York's not alone in this, that every global city is part of this competition. Global city mayors cannot opt out. They cannot simply decide not to compete for knowledge industries and for the high-value workforce upon which those industries depend, and urban quality of life is a weapon in that competition. And the standard palette, the toolkit that cities have deployed, is what a lot of us are familiar with, and what excites us and what we admire, at least as designers, when we visit global cities. So the standard thing is, of course, glamorized waterfronts, repurposed industrial buildings, swoopy footbridges. You have to have swoopy footbridges. It's not optional. Refurbish and revitalize transit systems, the systems themselves and the stations as amenities and locations for consumption, museums, parks that are frequently conversions of former industrial, sometimes just brilliantly reimagined infrastructure. This is the Promenade Plantée in Paris, which is, of course, the godmother of the High Line in New York City. And what creates the disparity, and what to me and to many of my colleagues is problematic, is that to the extent that enhancements of the public realm are purely or primarily market-driven and designed to catalyze private investment, they are going to tend to regressively distribute both public and private benefits, and the spaces used by poor people are not going to get that investment. In fact, they may be neglected to the point where, as in the case of Flushing Meadows Corona Park, there's talk of privatizing them. There was a proposal to build a Major League Soccer stadium in basically the last green quadrant of a park that's heavily used by low and moderate income, highly immigrant communities, because in the eyes of the Bloomberg administration, there was simply no money to address all of the long deferred maintenance in that park without privatizing it. So the contrast between what we do to attract the high-value workforce, the footloose people, and how we treat the neighborhoods in which people in the low ranks of the service economy live, the people who clean the office buildings and take care of the children and pour the coffee, the disparity is both perceived and real. The poor quality of environment in low-income neighborhoods increasingly affects people's health, their safety, and the life chances of their children. That we see bike lanes and protected bikeways coming into the most affluent parts of the city. People in other parts of the city still ride bikes. And I'm not claiming that the disparity in the built environment is the cause, obviously, of these inequalities. That is the dynamic of a globalizing economy. It's the dynamic of a polarizing service economy. And we certainly see that national policies, much more than local municipal policies, determine what that level of inequality is. It is still shocking how far off the scale New York is compared to our peers, to cities that we consider to be our fellow Western democracies, and how close we are to places where we really probably don't want to emulate the level of social disparity and exclusion that we see. So, like I say, it isn't that we're arguing that mayors should stop making those investments in the high-end parts of their public realm. That they cannot opt out of that competition. But what distinguishes cities is the care and attention that's given to public spaces that are used by poor and working class people, by vulnerable citizens, by older people, by children. And that's what I wanted to investigate in my fellowship. So, and the other sort of reflexive response is, you can't do that here. That American politics are so fundamentally different from Western and Northern European politics that there is nothing to be learned. And it's certainly true that the underlying fundamentally social democratic politic of much of Europe makes possible some of the more radical transformations that we see, but a lot of it is in the details. A lot of it is in the means and methods, the tools that cities can choose to employ that I found are fully transferable from my fellowship 4 basic lessons, and I'm going to try to illustrate the places where I found those lessons and their application to the New York City in the larger U.S. context. The first one is values really matter. that what's communicated by political leaders at the top needs to espouse values of inclusion, values of equity, and those values can then inform all policies and investments that flow from those political leaders. The tools themselves, the public agencies that are tasked with planning and implementation of urban projects need to be at the right scale. They need to have the authority, particularly the capital budget authority, to make the interventions that are needed. And they need to have a mandate and also the cultural competence to engage with the communities in which they work. And we don't always find that that's the case. We often remain stuck with the early 20th century model of urban management and agencies in technical silos that makes it difficult to achieve that kind of cooperation, and especially a city the scale of New York, that makes it difficult to bring that capacity to the local level where it's needed and where engagement can happen. The third is the public realm is a public responsibility, and that means that public money is what needs to be spent on its development and its upkeep. That nowhere in Europe, and I ask pointedly, is there the reliance on public-private partnerships to maintain public spaces like parks in the way that we've embraced that model in New York and elsewhere in the US. And finally, the public realm is more than just hardware. That the social infrastructure that communities build up over time and the extent to which that social capital is invested in on the government side and sustained in communities is essential to building and then to maintaining a just and inclusive public realm. So surprisingly, my first stop, this visit took place in the month of June 2012, and I went first to London, and almost by accident in a meeting with Mark Burley, who you see on the left, who is head of something called Design for London, we'll talk about, and in comes Boris Johnson. And what is striking is that the London Olympic vision, which was conceived was basically executed under a conservative administration, under Boris Johnson, and kind of didn't miss a beat. That hardwired into the London Olympic bid from its inception was that its purpose was not only to host the Games, but to regenerate the East End of London, and explicitly to bring the prospects for East Londoners, their health, their prosperity, and their life chances into alignment with those of their counterparts in other parts of the city. I cannot even imagine the most liberal American mayor. I can't imagine Bill de Blasio, who we just elected in New York, who is widely portrayed in the media as kind of a crazy-eyed progressive, using the word convergence the way Boris Johnson used it. What brought that goal, those values, into the physical realm was a plan that delivered improvements to the host boroughs, the communities around the fringe of the Olympic Park, simultaneously with the development of the Olympic facilities themselves, so that the communities that would have to bear the impacts of Europe's largest construction project got some benefits in advance of the Games themselves. And the Olympic Legacy Company was the entity created to make sure that that happened. It had a separate staff and a separate mission from the Olympic Delivery Authority. So the kinds of things that were developed that people were already enjoying before the Games ever opened would integrate with pathways for pedestrian and bike and vehicle access into the new Olympic Park, beautiful sports centers, the transit investments, including the restoration of the overground line, which is a circumferential transit line around the outer fringes of London, and improvements to the public realm. This and dozens of other streetscape projects were the work of Design for London, where the idea was simply to bring the quality of London's high streets, of which there are something like 600, streets, what used to be the main streets of the little towns that grew together to be London, and to bring the quality of those town centers into line with the more affluent parts of London. Now that, as Design for London would be the first to tell you, doesn't do anything to address the underlying social and economic realities that you still see in, on streets like this, money out of poor people's pockets from pawn. Even by the month before the Olympics, it was clear that the convergence goals were not being met, that the goals for employment, for education, for sports participation were not being achieved. Nevertheless, having a document to which the current and future administration can be held accountable, having actual metrics for those goals is an important step. The second lesson is with authority and capacity to achieve the goals. That once the values and goals are articulated from the top, there have to be entities that are able to deliver administratively and bureaucratically on those promises. The man in the picture is Paul Lecouard, who is a senior urban planner with the Institute, I'll say it in English, the Institute for Urban Planning and Development for the Ile-de-France region, which is the urban region that includes Paris. The IAU's focus is the Benelux, the suburbs that have, that have largely been left behind from the prosperity that the core of Paris has enjoyed. And different suburbs have different political leaders. It was the case in the region around Saint-Denis, which are the suburbs to the north and west, that their largely communist and socialist mayors were able to get together and agree on a comprehensive plan that has very effectively guided the development of the region to this day. So that's 20 years. It began with the construction of the Stade de France, the soccer stadium for the World Cup in 1995. And unlike other stadium projects, and unlike many other urban regeneration projects, the plan very carefully knitted together the stadium, the new development around it, the historical communities further away, particularly through a grid of open space, pedestrian and bicycle pathways, as well as waterways. And the result of that is that the regeneration of the area has actually benefited local residents and has enhanced an element region-wide that the IAU has been involved in coordinating is the development, for example, of a new circumferential tram line. So this, you see this in London, you see it in Paris, the recognition that outlying areas are poorly served by radial transit systems, and that circumferential systems, whether they are light rail, heavy rail, bus communities within and among the suburbs as well as to the urban core. Another example inside Paris is a local office established in the 17th and 18th to carry out long-term regeneration planning and engage with residents there. These are working class areas right along the periphery. And from 2009 to the present, there has been a planning process that's been carried on out of a local storefront with a highly professional planning staff whose job has been to engage local residents in determining priorities and then to do the often onerous work of coordination of all of the public agencies that are involved in delivering those improvements, the capital funding to make them possible. And the guy in charge of this office, Beckery Saunier, does a lot of his time is spent walking around, going to events, participating in events within the community, and really establishing a web of relationships with local residents, with local organizations, with stakeholders that then brings those local stakeholders into a position of ownership of the planning process. This is a contrast with processes that we often see in the U.S., where a team of planners will parachute into a community, hold a meeting in a high school cafeteria for one night, and vanish. And they take their drawings and presentations with them, and you don't see them for another couple of months. These guys work out of a storefront. Anyone can come by at any time, speak their mind, look at the documents, and so forth. And that has allowed a set of very substantial investments to be determined based on local priorities. So the thing that people wanted to see the most was additional affordable housing and childcare. That's what's being constructed here. People were interested also in having a greater diversity of commercial activities and opportunities on the streets. In the U.S., this kind of thing would, this planners might have led with street improvements like this, and that would have touched off fears of gentrification. In this case, residents see it as an integral part of the plan. They see their other concerns, housing and childcare, being addressed first, and it doesn't raise that issue. Okay? I think a project in Amsterdam, local planners refer to it as Our Crew at IGO. It was a massive failure of social housing, completed in 1975. It was based on a terrible design concept, which was that vehicle circulation and parking would be on elevated decks, which left the space under the decks as the perfect setting for antisocial activity. So recognizing the challenges that the project created, there was a plan to redesign it, perhaps to demolish it. Residents were very purposefully engaged over a period of years, during which time they made clear that they wanted to see the project fixed. They wanted its deficits to be addressed. They did not want it to be demolished. The majority of what were then 30,000 residents preferred to stay, but they wanted to see the project redesigned. So that was done. The circulation was placed at grade level. Commercial and institutional activities were placed at ground level within the buildings. Selected buildings were demolished, but most were retained. And particular needs that residents articulated, particularly the need for adult education, the need for spaces where services would be offered both for and by immigrant populations and women, and those were all designed into the renovation of the complex, as well as the kind of supermarkets and cafes and shops lining the streets, as well as some less conventional insertions, including a farm. In addition, there mixed affordability housing, including a number of market rate projects, were constructed in and around Boomere. So it is unclear whether gentrification in this either positive or negative. That it certainly makes sense for this area to have become more economically integrated than it was. The documents seem to show that low-income people were not displaced, that the units that were demolished were vacant, and there was no displacement of existing residents from the 1995 plan, but additional market rate and just below market rate units have been added. Cycle paths are extremely high quality. This is just a design thing that we don't see in the US and even in some European cities, that when you're in the historic urban center, there's good infrastructure for cycling. When you get out to the fringes of the city, it often disappears or becomes illegible. Not the case outside Amsterdam. And to see young kids unaccompanied by adults safely riding home from school through horse pastures to the projects is an image that will stay with me for the rest of my life. A lot of the inspiration for this trip was the work and speaking of Enrique from 1997 to 2000, who has famously said that a good city is a city in which a 7-year-old child can safely ride around on a bicycle or a tricycle. And Vilnius, as well as the rest of Amsterdam, really is that. Okay. The third lesson is about public money and public responsibility. That in the U.S., we have relied on public-private partnerships such as park conservancies and business improvement districts to a degree that insidiously skews our view of where public realm improvements can be feasible and where they cannot. That we have embraced a construct where if there isn't a source of private revenue for the maintenance of park space, we don't build it. Okay? That's wrong. Certainly, PPPs have been used extensively in Europe to finance major infrastructure and environmental remediation projects, large development projects, but PPPs are seldom, if ever, used for the routine maintenance of ordinary public spaces in the way that we rely on them here in the U.S. There's certainly those kinds of practices are starting to make their way in. The weekend I was in London was the Queen's Jubilee, and there were celebrations everywhere. There were all kinds of unusual circulation arrangements in and through Hyde Park and other places. And these so-called volunteer greeters turned out, I later learned watching news coverage, were people who had been bussed in from northern cities. They were welfare recipients who were compelled to do this volunteer service. And they told about having to change their clothes under bridges, that they had no indoor accommodation for the entire weekend that they were pressed into service. And this is turning the opportunity of the public realm to generate economic opportunity on its head. That instead, we should look at all public realm investments as ways to create ladders of skill and ladders of opportunity, especially for populations that face challenges to employment. We've done this in a few instances in the U.S. We need to institutionalize that paradigm. And that links to the fourth lesson, which is civil society and its role in shaping and maintaining the public realm. That without social capital, there is no public realm. If public space is not safe, for example, as in London, if it isn't safe for young people to use streets and squares and shops because of gang violence and turf wars, then that's a class of people that are excluded from public space. So this is a meeting that I visited of London citizens. They're a grassroots organizing group. Their leaders actually were trained in the U.S. And among other things, they waged a successful campaign before the Olympics for a London living wage. That the idea was public money was being spent, and that every job that was generated out of that investment, not only the construction jobs and not only the jobs for folks directly employed by the public agencies, but every subcontractor, every vendor, they said every tea shop within the Olympic footprint and subsidized or fostered as part in the host boroughs should pay a London living wage, which was something like 11 pounds an hour. So, and we have seen campaigns like that in the U.S. They have fought an uphill battle, and that needs to change. The youth members of London Citizens seized upon the public space and public safety issue and the challenges that young people face in occupying public space, and organized a campaign that they called the 100 Days of Peace, or City Safe. The City Safe is a long-term campaign where young people visit merchants on the local high streets, on the shopping streets, and persuade some of them to put decals in their windows where they identify themselves as a sanctuary for any young person who feels threatened, who thinks they're being followed, who's being menaced, and that young person can have a safe place of refuge and to call the police. The 100 Days of Peace took this citywide and drew, the young people said, on an Olympic tradition of a truce for 50 days before and 50 days after the games, so that athletes could safely travel to Olympic competition. And the young people staged events all over London in public spaces, including a dance mob in Euston Station, to kick off the campaign. So coming back to New York and trying to figure out what of this applies here, I thought I would have sort of a leisurely time doing that. And instead, as I'm trying to write my paper, comes Hurricane Sandy. And this was an enormous natural disaster impacting more people than any other in recent U.S. history. 10 million people lost electric power. 43 New Yorkers were killed. 65 billion total in property damage. And that was in part because of peculiar conditions to Hurricane Sandy, the pathway of the storm, the direction of the winds, the timing of the tides. Nevertheless, the impact was staggering and was largely unanticipated. The lesson of values at the top, to the extent that there was preparation in New York, it was around hardware. It was around protecting infrastructure. The subway recovered remarkably quickly and was back in service in a matter of days rather than months that one would have expected. But almost nothing was done to anticipate the reality that in any storm, even given an evacuation order, for many reasons, people don't evacuate. And the suffering that people faced in the weeks afterward, living in high-rise buildings, including public housing and also including private housing, where tall buildings had no electricity, therefore no elevators, therefore no heat, and therefore on the upper floors no running water, in some cases for weeks. City government was completely unprepared to deal with this, and instead the needs were met largely by volunteers, especially in the early days. That everything from the Food Truck Association, Occupy Sandy famously, and many lesser known and unknown organizations spontaneously mobilized to help their neighbors in need. And as the situation progressed from the need for immediate emergency relief to thinking about long-term recovery and rebuilding, communities have organized around fairness, and particularly around fairness, only the impacts, but taking up on the opportunity, thinking of recovery and rebuilding as a massive public works program, and thinking about that work creating living wage jobs. As luck would have it, one of my informants in Amsterdam was a woman named Tracy Metz, who is a US-born journalist, but who has lived in the Netherlands for many years, and who was in fact part of the National Water Board, the civic body that gives guidance to the engineers who keep the Netherlands from submerging. That something like 75% of Dutch GDP is produced below sea level. You may know these statistics better than I do. And when I met Tracy in June, she had just published the book Sweet and Salt about water management. And I thought, well, I'll just pick it up when I get home. Little did I know that it would be like the tulip bulb craze, that all of a sudden, if you could get it on Amazon at all, it was $1,000 a copy. So eventually there was another printing, and the price went down. Tracy, along with many of her compatriots, is now a transatlantic commuter because US officials recognize that we need to learn not only about water management engineering, but about the social infrastructure that makes that engineering possible. That the US political system is not very well set up to help people make large, long-term changes, to understand the need for change, to choose among alternative strategies, and to actually move forward. So again, the Bloomberg administration, to its credit, did a masterful job of compiling a set of over 100 initiatives for coastal protection. Whether we will be able to muster the political will to make those changes, and whether we will make those changes in a way that takes advantage of them as a massive public works program with the potential for employing the residents of, for example, public housing on Coney Island, which was one of the hardest hit areas, to both construct and then manage that green and gray infrastructure that we need to build, that will be another $60 billion in addition to the recovery costs, has yet to be seen. So we've just elected a new mayor, Bill de Blasio, who takes office on January 1st, 2014. And this is a good moment for us to apply the lessons of how the physical public realm can be an instrument of democracy and equity. So the first task is to bring the public realm into the discussion. That in the U.S. we look at things like education and law enforcement first, and we don't consider the ways in which our built environment really provides the armature around which an equitable society can be built. That we have, especially in the aftermath of Sandy, an imperative to rethink the way our agencies work with each other and work with New Yorkers. That we need to put those agencies on the ground in the impacted communities and give them the mandate to work with each other and with those communities. And we're starting to do that. We need to do it more aggressively. We need also to provide the space and resources in which civil society can thrive. That all of the individuals and organizations and local small institutions that jumped into the breach need a few resources, but they need those resources badly, particularly space. And above all, we need to recognize the opportunity of rebuilding the public realm and adapting to climate change, building it and then managing it over the long term as an unprecedented opportunity to create a jobs program. And that's being advocated by a number of grassroots coalitions, and we have reason to hope that the new administration will take that to heart. So that's what I saw. That's what I learned. I hope that that is, and I'd be really interested to have your reactions.
Thank you, Joan, for that excellent and very thought-provoking presentation. You can please submit any questions to Joan via the webinar panel. We have one question over here to kick things off for you, Joan. And I'd especially like to go back to the example of London. In the United States, sports stadiums are often seen as a redevelopment strategy for cities. How do you convince leaders that stadiums need to be part of a more comprehensive and also integrated strategy for the physical realm, that they can't just be one-time investments?
Yeah, well, I think there is a large and growing body of literature about public subsidy of stadium projects in the U.S. that shows that they largely don't carry their weight, that they almost never generate the economic benefit that is claimed for them as justification for public subsidy. So I think it's interesting to have examples from Europe where sports facilities actually deliver on that promise. And I think we can draw out the lessons, particularly of how they're integrated into transit systems, how they're integrated into the economies of surrounding communities. But I think the worst examples in the U.S., Yankee Stadium in the Bronx would be an egregious one. They exist in a bubble. That Yankee Stadium, has been located in the South Bronx for many, many years. We rebuilt it at a cost of several $100 million, of which about $200 million was public money. But we left control of the design and execution of the project to the private partner, to the Yankees organization. That's a contrast with the London Olympic projects and with the earlier Stade de France, where the public sector retained firm control. There's an organization chart of how the London Olympics were delivered, and the International Olympic Organization was in the conventional sense the client, right? That London won the bid. The IOC got to dictate what facilities it needed and so forth. But the Olympic Delivery Authority was set up in a way that it remained accountable to the national government and to the Greater London Authority rather than to the Olympics. That being a client is different from being the manager. And they managed to, through that mechanism, both the Olympic venues themselves, each of which, to the extent that for the facilities that weren't going to be demolished, each of those facilities had a post-Olympic business plan. The Olympic master plan was explicit and detailed about the way physically and through transit all of the facilities would be connected to the surrounding community. So I think there are some design lessons in terms of integration and connection, and there are management lessons about to whom the project is accountable.
Right. Another question here, and I encourage all of you to continue sending your questions. I want to kind of flip your research around a little bit. How do you think it's relevant for smaller cities? These cities might face the same challenges as the three cities you chose for your research, but they don't have the Olympics. They might not have the same level of resources to devote to these issues. So how does your research apply to smaller, more mid-sized cities?
That's a really interesting question that I've done a little kind of side research and thought about. The key thing is for political leadership, I think, to articulate its values and its goals, and not to let those goals be defined by external partners, because a challenge, obviously, for smaller cities is when they do identify a project or an outside partner or investor, it's easy to let that outside partner call the shots. And in a lot of those cases, the nominal reason for doing a project, which may involve public subsidy, it may involve displacing residents and businesses, and the justification of a public benefit is sometimes lost. So I think a key lesson is know what you're doing, know why you're doing it, articulate that in a way that you can be held accountable, and then try to structure the process so that it can achieve those goals.
Okay. So many of the rich examples that you included here in this presentation and also in your brief are from the neighborhood level, right? And this essentially involves a very fine-grained approach by a city administration. So one of the particular details that was very interesting about some of the planning agencies was that they were located in a neighborhood for a very specific reason. Can you comment a little bit on this approach of doing things? Are there trade-offs? What are the long-term benefits, perhaps?
Sure. The benefits, obviously, are that the planners and the other agency staff are accessible to the people that they're meant to serve. Another benefit is to, even though they go home at night to someplace else maybe, during your workday they are living what the residents of the community are living. And we're advocating for that model to be embraced in Hurricane Sandy recovery because people, the conditions that people are experiencing really shape their views and their priorities, and it's extremely necessary for planning staff to understand where people are coming from. Downside of that kind of decentralization, I mean, it takes some organizing, it takes some logistics. Enough of the transactions of public agencies are digital anyway, if the logistics are no longer an insurmountable obstacle, that it keeps track of them. There isn't any reason why the person issuing that permit can't be somebody with a laptop in a storefront instead of back in Borough Hall or back in City Hall. The challenge is for the agencies to coordinate with each other. That there isn't always integration of planning authority and capital budget authority. That the agents in New York, at least, the Department of City Planning has a very large staff. It has kind of confined its role to zoning because it doesn't control capital resources, it doesn't control public investments in infrastructure. So there's some work that needs to be done to make it possible for the agencies to integrate. Beccari-Sagné, who in the 17th and 18th in Paris, is a little bit hamstrung by the fact that he has to persuade the capital agencies to do stuff. He can't dictate to them that they must do it. So if you're decentralizing power, you're, to a certain extent, you're creating challenges for people to, to use the knowledge they acquire in communities and bring it back to guide bigger, more centralized agencies.
I'm wondering if the issue of demographic change came up at all in your research. This is a big topic, especially in Europe, and the aging population seen in most of the countries over there, and that will be coming here in the United States. So how do you think demographic change will affect the future of investments in the public realm? Will it change how investments should be made?
There's so many layers to that. I mean, on the one hand, the historical population of many European cities and some U.S. cities is aging, but there is a boom of in-migration of younger people, and that in some cases is immigration from other countries, and in some cases it's domestic migration from other regions. So there's often a dynamic between kind of the long-time residents of an area who are older, who in some parts of New York are whiter, and newcomers who are younger and who are blacker and browner. And it was in Clignancourt in Paris, there was a dynamic of the older generation sort of blaming the younger generation for problems when the problem was really one of deindustrialization and economic transformation. So I think recognizing the changes in age, in family structure, that the growth of multi-generational and multi-wage earner households in parts of New York City. I'm thinking of southern and eastern Queens and southeast Brooklyn that were traditionally these kind of almost quasi-suburban enclaves within the city, and they're much different now. And yet the public realm has not caught up. That we're doing some research in transportation in areas that are poorly served by the subway, where 30 years ago, Archie Bunker lived there, and everybody had a car or maybe two cars, and that's the population that lives there today. Their needs for transportation and the way they use public space is much different.
Joan, I'm wondering what your view of the future for New York City in the post kind of Sandy context is in relation to your lessons. What do you think are some of the key challenges that the new mayor will face in the next 2, 3, 4 years?
There are several. I mean, I think the big infrastructure, the coastal protective measures, are politically challenging to implement. They're going to require cooperation between city, state, and federal government. I think we can handle that. I think that's going to happen. A hard challenge is changing, the changing economics of living on the coastline. That coincidental with Sandy was a long overdue redrawing of the federal flood maps. These are the maps that identify the 100-year flood zone and the 500-year flood zone, and the availability of mortgages and flood insurance, and the requirement to carry flood insurance in order to get a mortgage is predicated on where you sit in those maps. And tragically, they had not been updated since 1983. They were in the process of being updated. The updates were quickly put out in drafts so that people could make planning and financing decisions around them. And at the same time, during the previous summer, we had also nationally revised the flood insurance program with the idea that we would move from a subsidized insurance program to a risk-based insurance premiums. The public policy rationale for that is solid, that why should we subsidize millionaires to live in beach houses? The reality is many people who live in the flood zone are people of extremely modest means, whether they're homeowners or tenants, and the combination of the new maps and the new insurance regulations will either make their housing unaffordable or make their housing untenable, that they can continue to live there, they can't sell it. Nobody can afford to buy it. Nobody can get a mortgage to buy it. So that's a huge set of social challenges and economic challenges that the new administration is going to have to unpack and come up with a fair solution. I think the Dutch can teach us something about that because, albeit at smaller scale, they have made it possible in some cases under their new paradigm of water management, which is basically making room for the water rather than holding it back with higher and higher walls. People have had to relocate. And our political system isn't set up to let us make that kind of decision. We try to send people market signals that they have to relocate. That ends up burdening poor and moderate income people much more than affluent people. So I think taking the Dutch model of not only dictating where people can and can't live, but what the Dutch do is build alternative housing, make it possible for people to relocate and retain their networks, their connections, their links to their places of employment and schools. We need to study that and do that.
One final question for you, Joan, and it's more based on your research and on the European aspect. What was the view of the Europeans that you met of your research and of what you were trying to do? And do you think there's kind of ongoing relevance for similar research to what you've done in the future?
People were, many more people than I have named here or in my paper were incredibly generous and helpful. And I think the relevance to Europeans of the U.S. experience is that where we have already gone in terms of privatization, in terms of acceptance of the stratification of society, is where they fear that they're going. And I think our experience is in many respects a cautionary tale. And on the positive side, I think the strength of civil society in the U.S., of bottom-up organizing in every kind of sphere and sector, from young people's organizations to faith groups to neighborhood organizations, is something that many European urbanists express some envy about. That because U.S. government is relatively weak, because institutionally we in the U.S. distrust government to carry out many things that government is trusted and expected to do in Europe, ordinary citizens step into the breach. So I think there's the give and take and the ebb and flow between those different dynamics, I think is of ongoing relevance to both sides of the Atlantic.
Great. Thank you, Joan. And with that, we'll end and conclude the webinar. Joan, I want to thank you again for the excellent presentation. And again, you can find Joan's full policy brief on gmfus.org, and to also find out a little bit more information about the fellowship program that Joan participated in. And with that, I'll close, and thank you again for attending.
Okay, and thank you.